maybe the whole while we were kind of tossing that idea around for 2 chapters now, the idea of sexual immorality, right? I mean, that's the note he sort of ends on in chapter 6. And we kind of talked about, okay, so the stuff about lawsuits, is that really about lawsuits, or is it about grievances, maybe even actually about the sexual immorality? And then in chapter 5, sexual immorality. So he's been talking about sex for 2 chapters already. So by the time we get to chapter 7, everything is kind of set already. And so, yeah, I think, and we didn't actually have a chance to even mention the really good point that you brought up, which is that, we've seen already a couple times, like back in 6:12, all things are lawful for me. Well, that seems to be a quote that he actually he pulls twice from their letter. But then, how do you identify what's a quote from them, which is a thing that he's disagreeing with, or it's just a statement of him that he's writing by the power of the Spirit, right? So it's sort of like, oh, okay, so it could be either totally wrong or like God approved right. That's a challenge. So, but like you said, that bit in 18, every sin a person commits is outside the body. That's a big one, and it certainly then affects how we're going to read things today in chapter 7. So we'll have to. We'll just go ahead and we'll read it through, but we're going to have to sort this out. What is he responding to? What is it that the Corinthians are maintaining as their position, and how is Paul trying to correct them as their pastor? So, it's a big puzzle, just in terms of interpretation, because we don't have the quotation marks and the punctuation in the Greek. So, some good things to keep in mind, but without spoiling anything else, let's just go ahead and read it here. Here's 1 Corinthians chapter 7 in the English Standard Version from the top. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am. But each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. But if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else should be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has called, to which the Lord has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who was called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who was free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain there with God. Now, concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as one who, by the Lord's mercy, is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord, but the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit, but the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks that he's not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It's no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then, he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet, in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think I too have the Spirit of God. Oh man, it's so super like practical and applicable. We're just, I mean, here he is, like he's just, we're like, well, why can't the Bible just spell it out for us, right? Like, well, guys, be careful what you wish for. So Paul is like spelling it out, right, in lots of detail.
Yes.
But the problem, right, is because it is so spelled out and nuanced, we're all standing back thinking to ourselves, okay, which parts belong inside parentheses? Which parts belong inside quotation marks?
Right.
I mean, like, just kind of tracking with this, it's really hard. And so it's like you were saying from the very beginning, verse 1, is that meant to be in quotation marks? And it's like,
Exactly.
you could see it either way, which makes the whole chapter a challenge for interpretation.
Right. And, we're going to get into the thick of this here in a second. One thing I wanted to say, though, is, we have to, in spite of the challenges of interpreting this, we have to preach on this. I remember I did a sermon series on 1 Corinthians, and I spent, about 4 or 5 Sundays just on this chapter.
Oh, yeah.
And older members had told me, gosh, we've never, in all our years, we've never heard a pastor talk about this so thoroughly. And I said, yeah, and I think that's a problem. The church really has avoided teaching thoroughly on sexuality from the pulpit, as it should. But we need to do that, especially in our culture today. And obviously here, Paul doesn't shy away from it. He spends several chapters on this issue.
Oh, yeah, no. I mean, like, it's interesting. Like, you just look at the Bible as a whole. How much of the Bible is about sex? A lot of it.
Yeah.
A lot of it. From like the very beginning, right? I mean, you've got sex in Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 and so forth. So, I mean, just to realize, like you were saying at the beginning, sex is just one of the most precious gifts from God, and taking that holistically. We're talking about sexuality, being man, being woman, family, love, the entire thing, taking a holistic view. And that holistic view, I mean, it's a huge portion of Scripture is like that. God puts himself in sexual terms. That in the Old Testament, you have this metaphor that's used all the time about the faithfulness. I mean, that's the word, right? Chesed, faithfulness, right, of God to, I mean, his bride, his wife is the language of the prophet. So I mean, it's really big, and it's not, I guess, in the way that people kind of stereotypically think of it as like, oh well, the Bible hates sex. It's like, well, I mean, on the contrary, it's like the Bible really, really likes it. I mean, so much that we can like put God in those terms. But yeah, I mean, it's like we're just, like you're saying, we're just scared to go there, even though the Bible seems to want to go there all the time.
Oh, exactly. And not only does God speak of being faithful to his bride, but when his people are unfaithful to him, he'll talk about you're whoring after other gods, you adulterous people. Yeah, so it's very applicable.
Yeah, certainly. So we can't go and just, I mean, it would be like leaving out the Old Testament or something like that.
Right.
I mean, you're leaving out like a huge portion of the Bible. I mean, probably at least 30% of it, frankly. So yeah. So we got to get into it, and so let's just go ahead then and take it from the top. So, okay. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, and they've put that in quotation marks in the ESV. I wonder if there are any other. I'm wondering to myself like what the NIV does. The NIV does the same thing, which is not usually the NIV and the ESV are going to be pretty similar on stuff like that. But I wouldn't be surprised if there were some other translations that didn't take it that way, and I'm guessing that maybe this is something that you saw as well, because what's kind of funny about it is that, like we were saying, it seems like usually when Paul quotes them, he doesn't give any warning. he just throws it in there in most places. So to like set it up as if there's like a colon and then a quotation mark would actually be unusual, and and kind of given the content and what he actually ends up landing on, you could put together a good argument that this is actually what he is saying and not them. But so I don't know, how did you kind of debate it with yourself?
Well, yeah, without getting into all, because there's tons of scholarly debate on this, but I would lean in the direction that this is a quotation. Earlier we have some pretty obvious examples of that. Food for the stomach, stomach for food. Everything's permissible. But one thing that seems to be, and we even get this with the earlier thing about all sins a man commits outside his body. After he gives these supposed quotations, in the Greek we have this but. Here's my response to this. Yeah. So that's what kind of leads me in the direction of thinking, okay, this is the slogan that some false teachers are using, but now here's my response to it. And taking it that way in this context, there's two reasons I would go there. Not only do I believe the Greek, they could argue this, but it leans in the direction that it's a quotation. But also, Paul, I think he's made it pretty clear that he is not against marriage and sex. Yeah. So for him to be saying, it's good for a man not to touch a woman, I don't think Paul would necessarily go there. So I think he's now, he had earlier in chapter 5 and 6, he's dealing with sort of a libertinism. Just do it. If it feels good, do it. But now I think he's dealing with a quotation that's dealing with more of an ascetic view. We're going to fall into the other ditch now and say it's good to not have sex at all. Okay. And his response is, okay, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality in Corinth, you should not think you're holier than you are. You should use God's gift of marriage so that you don't fall into the sins we discussed in the previous chapter. And then, of course, he goes on to, talk about and I think it's important to understand here, Paul is not saying that the only reason we get married is so we can have sex. There's obviously a lot more to marriage than that. But what he is simply saying is, if it's because you're surrounded by so much sexual temptation, rather than giving into your sinful impulses and using it in a way that's ungodly, don't pretend that you're beyond that. You're a sinner. So if you're one of these majority of people who don't have the gift of celibacy, take advantage of God's gift of marriage. And I think how applicable that is to our culture today.
Oh, yeah.
There were times in our history where, young people would get married in their teenage years.
Yeah.
It's only really until the last 100 years or so that people have been waiting till they're older. And now, especially in our culture where we have, I'm going to wait till I'm 30. I want to go to college and get a job and get some money in the bank. And get all at these young years in our lives when our hormones are going crazy, that is not very wise. I think Paul's advice is very good for our modern culture today.
Oh, yeah, no, certainly. And this is where, the conversation could get, just enormous in scope, right? Because you're talking about something that's like fundamental and systematic to the culture at large. And you're talking about, like you were saying, enormous cultural shifts that have, in many ways, changed fundamental aspects of human civilization, as you were saying, only within like the last century, against the backdrop of thousands of years, right, of human practice, right, where across cultures, right? So, whoa, we're talking about just enormous things. And you could go into all kinds of directions. We're going to try to keep it tethered, I think, a little bit. And maybe the best way is to try to focus on, okay, what's going on in Corinth? And as you said, there seem to be different factions going in different directions. So we'll get more onto that thought when we get back. Take a break, everybody. We're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7 on Thy Strong Word. Be right back.
Don't go on doubting, but believe in Jesus Christ.
Okay, so it's there's a lot of things we can talk about in 1 Corinthians 7, and we already got some email questions that we'll try to turn to. So, what is asceticism, and is Paul an ascetic? It's a good question. I think Pastor Eckstein already mentioned asceticism. Question: is lust the source of evil to the natural mind, or only the baptized mind? Is lust the source of evil to the natural mind, or only the baptized mind? Got to think about that. Is circumcision synonymous with baptism in the minds of Christian theologians today? Okay. All right, yeah. The circumcision or baptism secure salvation and freedom from lust. Okay, yeah, those are some interesting questions. I think we can definitely get back onto like what is asceticism, and I think he's kind of already explained this pretty much. Maybe it's about using the word as often. But he came down and said, no, Paul is not saying like sex is bad. Asceticism says, abstain from these things. But the stuff about circumcision, that's another wrinkle in all this. We're going to have to talk about that. Good morning. Welcome back, everybody. Thy Strong Word, looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7. If you've got a question for us, we already got a few via email. Join the conversation if you're listening live, 1-800-730-2727. Or if you're in St. Louis, 314-821-0850. You can also send an email to KFUO at kfuo.org, as we're going to take a look in just a second to these email questions we already got. And you can also get on the live stream, facebook.com/AJ Espinosa. We are joined by our guest, Pastor Thomas Eckstein, pastor at Concordia Lutheran Church in Jamestown, North Dakota. And we were just talking about how you can actually read verse 1 as it's presented in modern translations as a quote from a different faction here, right? Because clearly the last couple chapters, Paul has been taking aim at one faction that says, you know what, it doesn't matter. It's just, it's food, it's sex, it's just a bodily function. It's just like sneezing. Have I heard that before somewhere? It's just a bodily function, right? So I mean, there's one group that just wants to say, oh, whatever. It's nothing. It's just a thing that we do. And apparently, though, there's another group, and we've seen already, right, that in 1 Corinthians there's division. There's people who are saying different things. There's people who are not on the same page. So it's not hard to believe then that there's another one, right? And then, of course, this happens, right? When you think the other faction's the devil, you're just going to make your own position the opposite of theirs. And so it seems like there's another that's saying, like, no, it'd be better if we were all ascetics, right? Like asceticism. And so what could you like unpack that a little bit, what this position or what really this kind of like school of thought is and what might have been going on in Corinth with that?
Right. Well, basically, and whether they were influenced by an early form of Gnosticism or not. The thing with Gnosticism, where it's the emphasis is that the material is bad, and everything that happens in the mind, that's what's good, and so salvation is about having the proper thoughts that lead beyond this world. But it was interesting with Gnosticism; it can lead to either libertinism. Since the body doesn't matter, I can do whatever I want. Or it can lead to asceticism, like because the body doesn't matter, I shouldn't have anything to do with my physical desires. And it seems where this group, the ascetics, are going that direction. It's that, okay, all this material stuff, physical stuff in the world, it's enslaving us, it's binding us. So anything having to do with the body, we need to try to resist it and oppose it. And there were some who actually believed that the way to live a godly life was to avoid sex altogether and to not even marry. Right. And we even seen this among some of the Jewish Essenes. There were some of them who were teaching that, hey, we shouldn't even marry and have sexual relations. Right. And so Paul may be responding to the group that is going that direction. And after he says, make sure that you don't deprive each other, husbands and wives, don't deprive each other, have sexual relations, and based on a mutual decision. And if you're going to refrain, let it not be for sinful reasons, because you're trying to hurt each other or get back at each other. Right. Instead, let it be to do spiritual things. In this case, prayer. But then he goes on and says, "No, I say this as a concession." And again, that's been interpreted in various ways. But what I think the best way is his concession is, hey, I'm all for you taking time out from sex to do good things, but I'm not commanding it. It would be great if you were celibate like me, but you're not. So make sure that in marriage you are taking advantage of this gift so that neither of you is deprived and tempted to misuse this gift of sexuality that God has given you.
Yeah, I think that's the difficult middle path that Paul seems to be charting here, right? And don't anybody misunderstand. I don't mean to say, because this happens all the time, right? That we just kind of say like, well, let's just kind of take both sides of the issue and we'll just kind of cut it in half, and that's like the right thing. Like, no, I mean, because just like, well, brother, just like you were saying earlier, right? Like just opinions on sexuality from like the last 100 years now. I mean, it's sort of like, well, what do you want? Do you want like so far left that's fallen off the spectrum, or just really, really far left so that it's getting there? Well, let's just take halfway between, right? Like we're still way off center. So, so just saying like, oh, let's just take the in-between position doesn't necessarily prove anything or get you any closer to the truth. But he's charting this middle course because in this case they have gone onto different ends of the spectrum here, and so like you were saying, he wants to argue against the one that says the body doesn't matter, and therefore, like you said, it's a good term for it, libertinism, right? It's better than saying libertarianism, which is a very philosophical, political thing. Like, so libertinism, like I'm I can do whatever I want, like just however I want it, that kind of thing. Really, in many ways, part and parcel of individualism and consumerism, and kind of like that whole way of life that has come about in the prosperity of the West. And then, as you were saying on the other end, the asceticism of, whether it's related to Gnosticism or any other thing. But, you think of like, monks like living like in a cloister or a monastery or something like that, right? Where it's just them all by themselves and very strict. We're not going to have tasty food. We're not going to be around women. We're not, just that kind of just very austere way of living. Maybe even something that happens to a different extent elsewhere. But yeah, he's saying, no, really, for most people, like you were saying, if this is how God's called you, then this is how you want to go. And it's interesting how really Paul kind of always just gets back to that. It's just, how were you called? What gifts has God given you? It's not about like pursuing this kind of a priori, this is the hypothetical best or, supreme or most ideal or perfect way to live. It's like, well, hang on, like, what did God give you? Well, do that then. And it's kind of always just going back to God.
Oh, absolutely, and that's why, just a couple more pastoral comments on this. He like you said, he doesn't just take some arbitrary middle ground. He goes back to Genesis, really, and he goes back to God's gift of marriage. And I think Paul's point here, he talks much more about marriage in other places, especially Ephesians 5. But here he's making it clear that sex and marriage are meant to go together. They're not, two different things. One purpose of sex is procreation. But here I think, Paul is making the distinction between lust and love. Sex ultimately, in a biblical point of view, is meant to be an expression of the promise of marriage. It's meant to be almost a ceremony of reminding your spouse, I've committed myself to you for life. I made a promise of love to you. And to remove sex from that context, Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians 4, to just have sex without a promise of love in marriage is to reduce somebody to an object, of your lust. And so I think here Paul is making it very clear, with all this distorted sex going on in our culture, if this is an issue for you, and for many people it is, then use God's good gift of marriage where sex can be a good thing. And then one last comment, I want to point out that even though Paul doesn't necessarily go there in this text, even in a marriage, we have to be careful that sex isn't distorted. There's extremes in marriage too. I think Paul alludes to this. You shouldn't withhold sex from your spouse just because you're mad at him or her. It's like, okay, I'm going to get back at you. No sex for you. But then there's the flip side too. And maybe men are more guilty of this than women, and that is, I desire sex. So whether you're in the mood or whether you're hurt because of what I've done for you, done to you or said to you, that doesn't matter. You owe me sex, and I'm going to get it from you no matter what. That unloving approach to sex where it's all about me and not about you, Paul would be against that too. Here he's making it clear that it should be a mutual thing that builds each other up and rather than a sinful thing that tears each other down.
Yeah, no, that's right. And having the right view of sex even within marriage, right? Like that's a tricky thing, right? I mean, because I think that like you were kind of getting at, there's a sort of what I think from our perspective comes off as like kind of traditional or conservative almost in a way, a view that says, well, if it's in the context of marriage, it's all good. So just kind of like, whatever, yeah, you're married. What, and so like once you say that, it's just kind of like, and this is, I think, this just goes hand in hand with the way that we have like this very flawed individualistic view of I mean, really even of Scripture, where we're kind of looking at it as like, well, just let me look at the Bible and I'll kind of evaluate and see what does God say is out of bounds, and then I'll get to do whatever I want within those bounds, right? And that's just, as we've said again and again, that's just the wrong way to look at it. I mean, look at the way Paul's getting at it. He's like, don't make it about, like just, okay, God, give me the rules so that I can get on with doing whatever I want to do. No, it's trying to please God. Now, I mean, this is what I wanted to ask you about, because this I think is really interesting. Because he's getting into this, and he gets into these distinctions, right? Like where he's like, I say this, well, not I, the Lord, and then he backs off on the other way and says, well, not the Lord, just but I, and he's getting into all this like this really kind of nuanced stuff where he seems to be trying to talk about, well, I'm just trying to like make life easier for you, or I would spare you these difficulties, or I'm just trying to help you please God. This is, I feel like, just like a very different way of framing the conversation than this kind of like, just give me the rules and then I'll get on with my life kind of within those boundaries.
Oh, absolutely. He's really just trying to say that, especially when it comes to our sexuality, and with it understood in the context of marriage, it's he deals with this in Ephesians 5, where marriage is a reflection of the ultimate relationship that has been between Christ and the church. Yeah. So it's really meant to be about love. So rather than him just giving a bunch of rules about, sex or no sex, it's really about what's the purpose of sex and marriage, and how does that play out in our world today. And for the sake of moving on here, when Paul mentions these two things, not I but the Lord, or I but the Lord, it's important that we don't misunderstand this as though Paul is saying, hey, when I quote Jesus, you can take that seriously, but when I'm teaching you on another issue that the Lord hasn't spoken to, you can take it or leave it. That's not what Paul is saying. I think in this context, he's saying, hey, when it comes to divorce, we have a direct teaching from Jesus recorded for us, and we see that in the Gospels. But then when Paul goes on to deal with this other situation, a believer that, for whatever reason this happened, a believer is married to an unbeliever. When he says, I'm not the Lord, he's not saying, okay, what I'm about to say, you can take it or leave it. That's not what Paul means. What he means is we don't have a recorded teaching from Jesus on this, okay? But now, as one who has the Lord's authority, I'm going to tell you, what God's loving will is for you in this area.
Oh yeah, no, and that's well said. I mean, we just saw like in the last chapter, or was it 6 or 5? But he's talking about like here I am among you in spirit, so gather in the Lord's name and like expel this sinful man. I think that was 5. I mean, like clearly, his apostolic authority is not just, as you were saying, like take it or leave it, like buddy advice here, right? I mean, no. I mean, if Paul says something, it's like, no, that's authoritative. That's like you go with it. But right, like you were saying, like he is, I think, distinguishing it, and I think even a little bit further, perhaps, I might say that what he's trying to get at is that the advice that he's giving, the authoritative guidance, right? I mean, like, there's a word that we've seen in the last several months, right? Guidance from different agencies, and it's sort of like, this is our guidance, right? And it's like, it's authoritative guidance. But yeah, so his authoritative guidance, right? It seems like, to me, like he's trying to say, this is kind of for right now, this present situation. Now, isn't that interesting? In verse 26, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like moving this on. It seems like what he's talking about is, hey, there's this stuff from the Lord that's just kind of, this is how it is, right? Like when our Lord taught, what did he do? He went back to Genesis and was like, this is how it fundamentally is. That's timeless. But then, he's getting into this thing where he's like, well, concerning the betrothed, see, guys, there's this, in verse 26, this present distress that's going on. And under the present circumstances, this is what you need to do. So it's not timeless. It's authoritative, but it's for the specific situation. So this is really interesting. What's going on that would kind of require this kind of, and he goes on later, right? Like those who are married live as though they weren't, right? Even like, and he goes on with all these very hyperbolic statements, but it's like, what's going on that requires this special consideration?
Well, but just like everything else, there's debates about what Paul means by present distress. Some think it means that he believes Jesus is going to return, right? In that generation. I don't think that's the thing. Others believe that he's just referring to life in this fallen world. Life in this world is a distress, great tribulation, possibly. But others have thought that there's some extant literature that suggests there could have been a famine going on at that time in the Corinthian area. One area I lean towards, and it could be a combination of things, honestly, but one thing I lean towards is the present distress is, and we get this from Jesus, that being a Christian in this world, especially at that time, means persecution. Living for God in a place like Corinth, you're going to get pushback from the culture. And so I think that the present distress is, be prepared for the fact that living for God means life is not going to be easy. It's going to be challenging and difficult. And I think right now, of what it must be like to be a married person in North Korea, China, where you're Christian, but you're being persecuted, and not only are you thinking about your own skin, but you're thinking about your wife and children. Yeah. And how difficult that must be. So I think at least that's a part of what Paul is getting at with this present distress. It's like, okay, how do we handle these questions of sexuality and marriage? Do I get married? Don't I in this present distress?
Yeah. Well, no, and I thank you for that. And it's, I think that's very fair that, there are a lot of things that people throw out there, and there's a lot of debate. From myself, I think, I don't think this is a stretch at all, but you just look at the language as we've seen in Revelation, that just all this emphasis, as our Lord himself had, on the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem in the year AD 70, right? So Paul is writing before that. This is something that people very commonly miss, but even though these letters of Paul come after the Gospels in our sequence, these are the earliest documents of the New Testament, just in terms of when they were put down on paper, papyrus. Even though the Gospels talk about stuff that happened beforehand, they weren't actually written down in that form until basically the apostles got too old to keep preaching it orally, and then they wrote it down, right? But so that just means here that if Paul's writing, like say let's just say like the 50s, right? Then, well, this is a really challenging thing, right? Because think about this, like he's talking about people who are thinking about getting married and having kids and starting a family, and the whole thing is going to blow up in 10 to 20 years.
Right.
I mean,
right.
I mean, to think about what the Lord said, he's like, I feel terrible for the nursing mothers, right? Like, and the nursing mothers are going to be, that we had no children, right? I mean, and that they will say, blessed are the ones who never had any. I mean, that's actually what he says in view of the destruction of the temple, that it would be better if you didn't have kids, because on that day it's going to be so terrible when families are separated and brothers and sisters are dying left and right. I mean, so I think the Bible itself actually gives a pretty clear description of why it might not be good to start a family right then.
Right.
I'm sorry, you were about to say something in there. I kept going, but go ahead. I can't hear you. Did we lose you? May have lost the connection there. But yeah. So hopefully we can get Pastor Eckstein back soon. But yeah. So I mean, it's really something that there were things like famines and wars and conspiracies, and we saw that, right? How in Revelation there's a whole litany of things that led up to that big, just catastrophic event in the year AD 70. But so kind of in view of all of it, it really makes sense that Paul's giving this kind of very, like I was saying, conditional, timely, authoritative, as Pastor Eckstein was saying, guidance that, this isn't just kind of like take it or leave it. I'm just throwing it out there. But I am saying, guys, because of these very unique circumstances right now, you might want to put that off. You might not want to do that right now. I think I've got a note here that we got Pastor Eckstein back. Hey, we got
I'm
you.
Here.
We got you back. What you're about to say something?
Well, I was just saying, it was hard enough being a Christian at that time, and then, like you said, with the destruction of the temple coming up, I think Paul is just saying, hey, marriage is fine. If you want to get married, you're not sinning, but I want you to know that being married when the church is going to be going through this horrible time, hey, it's not going to be easy, and I'd like to spare you from that.
Right. Well, he does say that, right, in verse 28. Yeah. I would spare you that, right? Those who marry will have worldly troubles. I mean, I don't think he's just simply saying like, yeah, you're going to have more bills and you're going to have to like figure out childcare.
Right.
Yeah, no, we all get that. But like, but I think he's like, I would spare you having to change diapers at 3 a.m. I don't think he's getting, that's nothing, that's nothing. That's far outweighed by the joys of family and parenthood, right? But I think he's getting at this really specific stuff. And when he says that, and again, in verse 29, the appointed time has grown very short. So, I think there is that difference of kind of talking about what's fundamental and then talking about the specifics, which I think this is actually pretty instructive then for us, that we find ourselves in a weird situation where, like you were saying, the expectation now is to delay marriage till you're 30.
Right.
Of course, the human body doesn't know that. Like we've organized everything, right? So we have a very weird situation where it's like, if you're going to do this career or get this job, it's like you got to go away to this school and then away to that school, and that's going to make being married really challenging. So, I mean, I think this actually then kind of encourages us to take this holistic approach and say, okay, what are the fundamentals of marriage? And then how might we need to tweak things given our present circumstances?
Right. And, and Paul's advice would be, I guess I have a couple pastoral comments on this.
Yep.
First of all, if you are going to wait for marriage because of these modern different ways of doing things, then the obvious teaching would be, okay, that's fine, but then be prepared to be celibate. Don't deal with your urges by, I'm going to engage in prostitution or just, have one-night stands. No, that's not an option, Paul would say. That's where self-control would come in. But then I would also like to add, even though Paul doesn't specifically mention this, even though Paul is lauding the benefits of being single because, hey, I would have more time to serve God and serve others I think in our modern world, a lot of people choose the single life for very selfish, ungodly reasons.
Yeah.
If being single is all about, I get to serve me, I get to use all my money for me, I get to do what I want, I'm not so sure that's a godly Christian reason to be single.
Yeah.
For Paul, being single is always, hey, the reason I'm not going to get married is so I can give more of my time to helping others and serving others in the Lord. It's not about, I'm going to party.
No, that's right. Well, I mean, to your point, right? What does he say? Again, I mean, it all kind of goes back to this. What he said earlier in verse 7, each has his own gift from God. I mean, it's basically like, well, if you have the gift of celibacy, you ought to go with that, right? Like, or I mean, right. It's interesting. I'm not sure it's like only if you necessarily have that, but I mean, like he does talk about self-control, and so it's like. What he is saying, like, regardless of whether one considers himself celibate or the vernacular today is like asexual, right? Like regardless of whether you have that, if you think you can actually just abstain, right, from like the whole like sexual arena entirely, then maybe that ought to be something that you consider with these weird circumstances being what they are. But Paul's pretty clear. Like,
right.
if that's not you, which, let's face it, especially in this culture, C.S. Lewis said our present culture inflames human sexuality because companies make more money off of us if we're like that.
Oh, yes.
So
yeah.
I think there was...
And since we're almost... Yeah. Since we're almost done, one last thing I wanted to say, because I think it's so applicable today. It's interesting. Even though he's saying, you might not want to get married in light of the present distress, it's interesting that he says, but if you're already married, I don't care how bad it is, I don't get divorced.
Yeah.
And I think in our culture, ever since no-fault divorce, where it's like, we have the irreconcilable differences, we're going to blow this off. Paul here is saying, hey, if you're already married, I don't care how bad it is. You don't divorce each other. This is a promise. And I think we need to really hear that. And I realize there's a lot of hurting people in our churches. They've been through a divorce, and some people have been through a divorce even though they didn't want it. I realize that. But at the same time, our culture, our church, I think, has gotten way too comfortable with our cultural view of divorce. And we need to go back and realize, marriage is a gift from God, and we are to take that promise of love seriously. We shouldn't just willy-nilly cast it aside. Is there forgiveness for divorce? Absolutely. But that shouldn't then lead us to the idea, well, then it doesn't really matter if I just, break this vow and move on. It doesn't matter because I can be forgiven. Paul would say, no, don't take that attitude.
Absolutely. I appreciate the pastoral heart of your comments there for us all. One last thing then, we only have a minute here. So, okay, he talks about, by way of encouragement, I think, like say, hey, look, guys, not only does the Lord just say, don't get divorced, but maybe even if you're married to someone who's not a Christian, maybe you will end up saving your spouse, right? And then he says this stuff about, and after all, right, because you are in the faith, your children are holy.
Yes.
Briefly, like what's maybe like the best summary you can give of what on earth is he getting at?
Well, I think there Paul is saying in the best construction, the ideal situation, not only is the believer. Now, this doesn't mean, I can go ahead and marry an unbeliever. That's a separate issue.
Right.
Paul makes it clear Christians should marry Christians.
Yeah.
But he's saying, in this context where the gospel came to Corinth, and you might have two people who are unbelievers, and then one of them comes to faith.
Right.
Okay, well, now you have a believer married to an unbeliever. Paul is saying you can have good influence on your spouse.
Yeah.
In fact, you might even be able to convince your spouse to baptize your children. I really think that's what Paul's alluding to there. Your children are holy because your spouse is allowing you to raise them in the Christian faith and baptize them. Okay, and that's why Paul says, if your spouse is an unbeliever, don't just divorce them, or him or her. You might be able to bring them to Christ.
That's right. Don't ever underestimate God's ability to insert grace into every kind of situation, even the present distress. Thank you so much, brother. I'm glad we're able to get you back. Looking forward to having our next conversation together.
All right, God be with you. Yep.
Thank you, brother. Everybody, that's Pastor Thomas Eckstein at Concordia in Jamestown, North Dakota. Going on to Chapter 8 now. We're going to talk a little bit about 7, I think, again. There's so much going on. But until then, I'm Pastor H. Espinosa. Peace.
Broadcast Ministry of the LCMS. Your support is vital for this program to continue. You can make a gift safe, secure, and easily online at KFUO.org. Thank you for listening and supporting Thy Strong